Welcome back to our Washington, D.C. studio for another special interview. This week we're joined by Ambassador William Miller. He's a senior fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center of Scholars. Ambassador during the Clinton administration to Ukraine, had initially a posting in Iran in the early 1960s. Welcome.
Very nice to be here.
Glad you could join us. Ambassador, there's been a great focus both in the Republican primaries in the recent weeks and months, and of course in the U.S. media, over the issue of the U.S.-Iranian relationship, which, you know, while people may have anticipated that it would go in a different direction once George W. Bush was no longer president, still is inflamed with a high degree of tension, threats, intensifying sanctions, the possibility of war. What's your read on this? Is this part of politics in the election year, or is it bigger than that?
Well, certainly our election politics complicate matters, to say the least. Our politicians speak in a very high rhetoric that sometimes strays from the realities of the time. And they're appealing, obviously, to specific audiences rather than dealing with the tough questions that we face. And this is particularly true in the case of Iran. We've had such a troubled relationship with Iran since the hostages were taken 33 years ago. We've not forgotten that, and it's in the forefront of all of our emotions. It's a psychological barrier, and it's a place that we have to consider in everything we do with Iran. On the other hand, Iran is a nation that we've had very close relations with for most of our mutual history. We once thought of Iran as the linchpin of stability in the Middle East, as Henry Kissinger termed it. And I think, once again, in the future, not too distant future, Iran will be a partner with the United States in maintaining stability in the new Middle East that's forming now. The events in Cairo, Tunisia, that are taking place in Syria now, throughout the Middle East, are going to continue, and the three great nations of the region are Iran, Turkey, Egypt. How they work together and how we work with those new nations will determine the nature of stability in the region. So we have an enormous task of understanding the new dimensions of the Middle East. We have the base problem of the Arab-Israeli conflict, which has determined attitudes throughout the world, mostly of a negative nature. That has to be resolved. And the three nations that I mentioned will lead the way to the resolution of settlement between the Palestinians and the Israelis. We have to play a very significant role because we're the world's great power. We've been there recently in the form of two major wars, Afghanistan and Iraq. This is hardly creative work. We have a lot of repairs to undertake. We have a lot of fence mending to do. We have a lot of creative diplomacy to engage in. It's a very tough problem, but we have to face it. And what's very interesting about Iran, and my experience there goes back to 1959, when I first was assigned there as a junior officer in the Foreign Service. I could sense then, as a young man in my 20s, that the regime of the Shah was unpopular, that the best people in the country and most of the country wanted a different form of government. There were opportunities for democratic government under the king. They were missed. And so revolution occurred, and the Shah was thrown out. We have this revolutionary regime that has undergone change in the 33 years of its existence. And I'm sure it will change even more over the coming decades. But we have to remember, as a revolutionary society ourselves, that it took us up until the end of the Civil War to settle the nature of our revolution.
Well, that's an important point, and certainly if you look back to the first 33 years of American history after the victory in 1783, the victory of the American revolutionaries, ample changes took place, and the process of democratization was quite slow in coming, especially for large constituent parts of the population. But I want to go back to the way you framed the question in the beginning. Like, for the Americans, a frame of reference is the hostage takeover in 1979. That was a big part of what happened to the Carter administration, the advent of the Reagan administration, and the general national psyche in relationship to Iran. Now, for the Iranians, their frame of reference goes back to 1951, 52, 53, to the overthrow of the Mossadegh government by the CIA and British intelligence after a long period of economic sanctions, because Mossadegh, in spite of the fact that he was a democratically elected prime minister, nationalized the oil and was considered an adversary. Now, when President Obama came into office in January 2009, shortly thereafter, on June 4th, 2009, he went to Cairo and he made a speech to the Muslim world, and it was largely viewed as an effort to rehabilitate the U.S. image, especially in the Middle East, after the catastrophe of the Bush years. And he acknowledged for the first time the role of the United States in the overthrow of the government in Iran. Was that simply for cosmetic purposes, or did something else happen that allowed or forced or compelled the Obama administration to shift back into this position of extreme antagonism? The sanctions imposed on Iran are greater today than they were during the Bush era, even though the intelligence assessment is the same. No nuclear weapons, no serious decision for a nuclear weapons program. What happened?
I think you've hit on the crux of the problem that we face. I think President Obama clearly, in his inaugural address, in the references to Iran there, and in his Cairo speech, laid out an approach to dealing with this part of the world that was, in my view, extremely enlightened, that it took account of a desire for change, a desire for development, for a better life, and a revulsion at authoritarian regimes, and a desire to help those who celebrate and embrace democratic values. There was great hope throughout the Middle East that Obama's words would be followed by action. It's a very complicated region, and there were all the political dynamics of the region were different than ours. They had a political energy of a different character than our perception. So the problem of old alliances, after all, we had been close to Mubarak, for example. We had been close to the leaders of Israel. We had tangled with the leaders of the Palestinians in their various forms. We had embraced the friendship of the Saudis and those regimes in the Arab world which are authoritarian. We came up against revolutionary ideas, many of which come from us. I remember very well in 1979 that the students who were involved in that, some of them were at Berkeley, and they learned some of their revolutionary tactics in California. And they studied democratic life and thinking by living in the United States. Iran was the #1 nation that sent students to the United States. From 1950 until the revolution, 50,000 students came each year from Iran to universities in the United States. Many of those graduates are in the government of Iran now.
Certainly.
And it shapes some of their thinking. We have to understand that. We don't understand it because we don't have any contact with our compatriots, with people who are in many ways from the same traditions, certainly intellectual traditions, as ourselves. That's what has been missing drastically in the 33 years of estrangement, is that we've had no people on the ground who know Iran, we've had no one to reach out to their leadership. We've had no engagement. I would say that we've made a mistake in the last several years. We have said that we're on a two-track mission, sanctions and diplomacy. We've had sanctions, but no diplomacy.
Let me ask you about that, because and I think you're quite right, that in spite of the hopefulness that may have existed when Obama came into office, and signaled very explicitly a change in direction, at least in the atmospherics, which are not unimportant in the Middle East. But we had Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, here recently. Both President Obama, Netanyahu, and Republicans spoke at the AIPAC conference. While there was clearly distinctive messages and differences between Netanyahu and Obama, both seem to share certain foundational premises. One is that there should be very severe economic sanctions against Iran. Both seem to indicate that this is an existential threat to its neighbors, to Israel, to the United States. Both have adopted the language that the U.S. and Israel would prefer war even if Iran achieves a capability for a nuclear weapon, not a weapon itself, but simply the capability, in other words, the industrial and scientific infrastructure. And the Republican Party nominees are competing with each other for who can sound like a greater warmonger against Iran, and condemning Obama for not starting a war with Iran. In other words, it's between a military option and a more severe military option, or economic sanctions coupled with a military option. And instead of diplomacy, engagement, mutual respect, it seems to have gone back into a camp of where even the most liberal position still sounds like a war position, or a near war position. How can that change if it's such an imperative necessity for it to change? You identified Egypt, Turkey, Iran as the three major countries in the Middle East, obviously a region that has great geostrategic importance for the United States. I mean, how does that change?
By working the problem in a systematic, straightforward way, by talking. That's a place to begin. We have forgotten how to talk to each other. And this is a egregious mistake. I've been engaged in what's called Track 2 diplomacy, which means that I can go to Iran, I can meet with Iranians, I talk to them, listen to their point of view, and communicate this to our government when I come back from trips to conferences in Iran or in Europe or elsewhere. I convey points of view that we have, our official points of view about Iran to them. But it would be far better if our diplomats talked directly to each other.
You're going as a private citizen, even though you've had a lifetime of government service. You're going as a private person.
Right, and I have friends who are in the government now, who are in senior positions in the State Department, Defense Department, and in Congress, and so on. And I have friends in Iran who I've known since 1950s, and they're good friends. And we share many of the same values. We grew up together, so to speak, in a very troubled world. We were educated together in the same institutions in America, in England, and elsewhere. So I think that's the place to begin, is with direct contact between our diplomats. It's unconscionable, in my view, to prohibit our diplomats from engaging with their counterparts. It's difficult even in New York at the UN, or in Geneva at the UN, or in Vienna at the UN, where talk is the currency of getting things done. So I think that's the place to begin. The key issue is whether Iran is intending to go down the weapons track, nuclear weapons. And the Iranian government position, their declaratory position in the world, is that they have no nuclear weapons, they will not produce any, they will not disseminate any, and have no intention of getting into the world of nuclear weapons. That's their declaratory policy. It's their official line. It's reinforced by religious dicta, the fatwas, of both Ayatollah Khomeini and Khamenei, the present leader, supreme leader. They speak for their nation's religious view. And they are of the view that weapons of mass destruction are forbidden by Islam. That's their position. We don't believe it. The West doesn't believe it. It has great skepticism about its truth. Test the proposition. That's the operative issue. I would approach it, if I were practicing as a diplomat now, to say, prove it. Prove it. I'd like to believe you. I just came back from a trip to Geneva and to Vienna. I went to the IAEA and met with the inspectors. And they're an impressive lot. They do a very good job under great difficulty. The relationship with the Iranians is a difficult one, because you're dealing with a nation of great pride and belief in its correctness and its rights under the NPT. And the separation between what might be moved in the direction of weapons and peaceful uses is a technical problem that the IAEA is equipped to answer and they're answering it. Iran is the most inspected place in the world. And up to now, they have found no evidence of nuclear weapons. Certainly, there are suggestions that there are military aspects to their program which could, if a decision were made to have nuclear weapons, have application. But that's not the case now. If Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons, they have a full right under the NPT to peaceful uses. So what is their program? I asked, what is the program? They intend to have 20 nuclear reactors within 20 years. And ironically, this is a program that was suggested by Eisenhower in the period of Atoms for Peace. David Lilienthal came to Iran and helped them work out a program of nuclear energy along with high dams and gas and oil-fired energy generation.
There's a great deal of construction in the 60s of such nuclear facilities with the support of the United States in Iran during the time of the Shah.
That's right. But there was only one reactor that was begun, and this is the Bushehr reactor, which went from the Americans to the French, the Germans, and now the Russians have finished this. But their intentions, as declared, are to have a substantial part of their energy generation come from nuclear power, on the premise that the value of oil and gas is much greater for export or for making into products that derive from carbon.
That's an entirely credible rationale for the development of a civilian nuclear energy program.
And it's a rationale that we contributed to. Further, a large part of their brain power, the physicists and nuclear engineers who were involved in this work, were trained in the United States. They're American-trained physicists. And like our physicists, they know the great dilemma of power that the atom has, that you can destroy or it can create. And up to now, it's very clear that most of them, if not all, are of the view that it makes no sense to have nuclear weapons. They can't be used. If they are used, it's catastrophic for everyone concerned.
Let me just ask you, because even though we had 30 minutes, the time is running very quickly, and we only have a few minutes left. I want to ask you this: if given the facts that Iran is the most inspected country in the world, that they have a right, according to the NPT, to have civilian nuclear energy program. That they're, according to their declaratory position is that they don't have nuclear weapons, and that it's in contravention even to their fundamental religious beliefs, to Islam. Given all of that, and the intelligence estimate by the CIA that Iran has no nuclear weapon, and we know Israel has many nuclear weapons and isn't part of the NPT and doesn't subscribe to IAEA monitoring regime, and that the United States and other countries that are pivotal to the region do have nuclear weapons, it might occur to the Iranians that the issue really isn't about their nuclear program so much, but using the nuclear program as a pretext by Western powers, or Israel in combination with Western powers, not to stop a nuclear program that doesn't exist, but really to use it as a way to impose economic sanctions, destabilize the country, carry out regime change similar to what happened in 1951, 52, 53. And that as such, they see this not as an honest effort about nuclear weapons, and that, in fact, there's nothing they can do to satisfy those whose real agenda is something other than stopping a nuclear program, and that agenda is to actually overthrow the government. That would account for a great deal of skepticism about allowing inspectors in, or not inspectors, but others who use the weapons issue as a pretext. I mean, similarly, we saw that in Iraq. Iraq was heavily inspected, had thousands of inspections. The inspectors knew Iraq had no nuclear weapon. But the imagery of nuclear weapons were used as a fear tactic by the Bush administration to justify more aggression against Iraq. Is it possible that that's really what's driving U.S. policy, not simply the nuclear issue?
Oh, I don't think so. No, I think Obama's words are what he believes. He is constrained by people who have other beliefs. And,
meaning the beliefs that I'm talking about.
Yes, and there's no doubt that we have people who are of that view. And certainly in Iran, there are people of that view that see the world as haves and have-nots, as the great powers imposing their will on the small powers, that it's unjust. And certainly you can have a considerable discussion and debate about the justice of for example, sanctions. I mean, the Security Council, being the great powers, has imposed sanctions, and we have, as a great power, imposed our own set. This is a form of warfare. Obviously, it does harm to the object, and it's seen by Iran as unjust. That they haven't done anything that deserves this kind of reaction. So, how to settle this hash? I would say you have to begin by direct contact. The leadership of our country has to engage with this problem, particularly since it is so grave that it could end in war. You know, this is the worst form of result. It's a failure of reason. It's a failure of diplomacy if you go to war. It's a means that is primitive and destructive, and in the end only creates revenge. People don't forget if their cities are destroyed or if their people are killed. They never forget that.
In 15 seconds, because that's all we have left, do you think a second Obama administration would represent a change if President Obama is reelected? 15 seconds.
I think Obama is a great president, and he has the capacity to lead in a constructive, positive way, and I hope he will.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. We're joined this week by Ambassador William Miller. He's a senior fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Great to have you.
I should add that I had the Iran project, Search for Common Ground.
Search for Common Ground. Okay, thank you very much. We'll see you next time.